So the last time we looked at a movie called Dressed to Kill, where Sherlock Holmes and this guy named Julian Emery were looking at the data from an event that occurred to try and create a model of this data. And it turned out it was a burglary. Julian Emery was satisfied with the explanation that it was just a random burglary, and the burglar, for whatever reason, exhibited some peculiar behavior. Now, Sherlock Holmes, on the other hand, wasn't satisfied. He agreed that it was a burglary, but that peculiar behavior meant that there was something else going on. And so Sherlock Holmes simply said, can't really come to a conclusion about the burglary, but more data is needed. That's where he kind of came down. Now, oftentimes, that's what's going to happen when you and somebody else are looking at a particular event and you're trying to draw data from it so that you can create a model of exactly what happened. Sometimes you're not going to agree, and that's okay. But what we're going to look at today is a circumstance where two people are looking at some event, some idea, trying to create a model of it. And one person, for very good reasons, doesn't want the other person to be able to model the reality. And this is something that you're going to encounter a lot. Maybe you've perpetrated such a thing where there's something going on, you don't want somebody to know about it, and so you engage in a little bit of deception, trying to keep people from really understanding what's going on. And that's what we're going to look at here. And it's a very interesting place. This is an article that I came across probably, maybe a year ago, back when I was looking at, I was studying Calvinism, and I came across this article, which I found very interesting. So just for a little background here, there is a church, according to this article, there's some church that's looking for a pastor. For whatever reason, they don't have one. They put a committee together and have someone head up this committee who is the interim pastor. And this interim pastor is interviewing this young man named P.J. Tibian, at least that's how I'm going to pronounce it, for possibly taking on the job as the new pastor of this church. It doesn't have a pastor. But there's a problem that comes up right in the beginning of the interview. Again, if this particular article is an accurate depiction of the event of this conversation, this interview. And we don't know, we just have this person's, Tibian's, recollection of it or his portrayal of it in the article. And, I find him less than honest, so we have to understand that this is just his perspective of it. But if you look right in the beginning of the article, the first thing that this interim pastor asks him, he says, "Are you a Calvinist?" Okay? And he says, "If you're a Calvinist, then this candidacy is over now." So the interim pastor makes it very, very clear that whoever they want as a pastor of their church, they do not want someone who adopts the ideas of Calvinism. Now, when the interim pastor asks Tibian, if you're a Calvinist, and Tibian's response in the article at least is, how do you answer that question? One possibility is honestly, meaning he could have just said, I'm a Calvinist, and I understand you don't want a Calvinist. However, I think that you can preach the Bible and not preach Calvinism. At least that's what the rest of the article, if you go on to read it, that's exactly what he goes on to write in the rest of the article, this idea that you can be a Calvinist but not preach Calvinism in the Bible. Now, I think that's impractical, and I don't think that that's possible. Anytime something is a core belief in your noetic structure, I find it, I'm skeptical that anybody could talk about the world and how they see it without including this basic belief that holds up their whole noetic structure. And if you're a Calvinist and you're talking about the Bible, it's at the bottom. So Tibian's idea that you can preach the Bible without preaching Calvinism, I think is false. But at the very least, this is something he seems to believe. So in saying this, while I think it's impossible, it's at least honest. And that's my point. If you're going to be a pastor of the church, it seems like being honest would be like, I don't know, one of the top things you would expect. in your pastor that he deals with people honestly and not through deception? But for some reason, that's what this Tibian guy goes to, is deception. And let me explain to you how he does it. This is something that probably we've all engaged in. It's either happened to us or we've done it. I'll raise my hand. I know I've engaged in this thing. It's called the bait and switch. And here's how it works. So first, to understand Tibian's position, he's someone who, in my opinion, is steeped in dogmatism. And what that means is, whatever his belief system is, and Calvinism seems to be his belief system, as he's admitted, he thinks that his belief system and the truth, whatever the world really is with regard to these ideas, he thinks they're the same thing. Unlike, again, that Rene Magritte picture where you understand that the picture of the pipe is not the pipe, but simply an attempt to model it, at least some aspect of it. People, in my opinion, who are like Tibian have merged the two. And so in this picture, you have what's called the noetic structure, that triangle, that collection of your beliefs, what you think or your model of the world. And behind it is the real world. And people who are dogmatic have merged them in such a way that they're inextricable. You can't know where one ends and the other one begins. They think they're the same thing. And that causes a lot of problems when you're trying to talk with somebody like that, because you can't separate the real world, the objective data, from how they've modeled it. And so it makes it difficult to have a conversation that way. But when you're in that kind of a conversation, what you're trying to do is, for example, in this particular conversation, you have an interim pastor who has made it clear that he does not want someone who has adopted the ideas of Calvinism to lead the church. This interim pastor is leading this committee, and they've said we don't want a Calvinist pastor, which obviously brings up a problem for Tibian because he's a 9 marks guy, and not only has 5 points of Calvinism, he has 7. I got to put my fingers up there. So there's a problem, obviously. Tibian wants the job. He's a Calvinist. The interim pastor is looking for somebody who's not a Calvinist. So what do you do in that instance? Well, if the interim pastor's doing this correctly, conducting this interviews correctly, his focus, his questions will be on that little circle in the middle, 5-point Calvinism. He should understand it, and all of his questions should be drawing data from that particular idea, objective data. The 9 marks guy, Tibian, it's the last thing he wants to talk about. Because ultimately, if he talks about it enough, the pastor will figure out that he's a Calvinist and the interview's over, as the pastor said at the beginning. If you're a Calvinist, we're done here. Let's not waste each other's time. So what does Tibian do? He asks him, and this is brilliant. In the article, he asks him, what do you mean by Calvinist? And then the interim pastor replies, by Calvinist, I mean you only share the gospel with the elect, and you don't need to pray for people's salvation because it's already determined. And what Tibian responds with that is, based on that definition, I'm not a Calvinist. And 4 months later, he was installed as the pastor. Okay, what went wrong? The interim pastor clearly doesn't want a Calvinist. You've got a 5-point Calvinist or a 7-point Calvinist here, admittedly, yet he became the pastor. What went wrong? Well, in my estimation, here's what went wrong. Instead of what the interim pastor should have been doing, which is focusing on this 5-point Calvinism idea, and that should be the topic of discussion. When Tibian asked the question, well, what do you think Calvinism is? He shifted the discussion from the reality of Calvinism to the interim pastor's very weak idea of Calvinism. And it's a very poor idea of Calvinism, because even if it's it's possibly implied by Calvinist ideas that you only share the gospel with the elect, and you don't need to pray for somebody's salvation because it's already determined. And so to understand why the interim pastor has this idea, just a little bit about Calvinism. As a matter of fact, if you go to the article, Tibbian makes this point that he's a 7-point Calvinist. So let's look and see what a 7-point Calvinist is and what that in fact entails. So this is an article by a guy named Matt Perman, and it says when John Piper says he's a 7-point Calvinist, he does so half jokingly and half seriously. Historically, there are 5 points, historically there are 5 points of Calvinism, not 7. Piper isn't seeking to add 2 more points, but is simply calling attention to his belief that in the traditional 5 points, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints, that's the TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, in a way that also points towards 2 additional Calvinistic truths that follow from them double predestination and the best of all possible worlds. So just a little bit about those 2 ideas. The first 5, again, is the basic Calvinist idea. But some people take the implications of those first 5 ideas, like Piper, and apparently Tibbian also does the same thing, and takes it to its obvious conclusion, which is double predestination. So what Calvinism tends to do is say that only focuses on the idea that God picks the elect, quote unquote, which I think is a bad interpretation of that word in the Bible, but that's for another day, and says these people are going to heaven. And that's really all they talk about. But the necessary implication of that is the rest of the people that God makes, he's creating them specifically to send them to hell, and nobody knows why. That's the double predestination. You're either predestination to go to heaven, but you're also predestined to go to hell. Nobody knows why. The best of all possible worlds is also tossed in there, kind of like duct tape for the whole thing. Because if you go, well, why would God create a bunch of people specifically to send them to hell, and there was really nothing they had to do with it? I mean, there's nothing they could have done to stop it. They were going before they were even born. It doesn't make any sense. Well, the best possible worlds idea is to tell you to just stop thinking about it and shut up. Because whatever God does, it's right, even if it seems crazy and insane and evil. Whatever God does, it's the best thing. So don't even ask about it. That's what that best possible worlds thing is. Not only is it a wacky idea, nobody quite gets it, but shut the hell up because God, whatever God does, it's right, and you shouldn't even ask about it. That's the best possible worlds thing. At least that's how I understand it. And I'm sure Calvinists will go, no, that's not how it is. And that's fine too. I understand it differently than they do. So to understand why the interim pastor says, well, you're only going to pray for the elect. You don't pray for the elect and you only witness to the elect, is the idea that, well, the only people who are going to heaven are a certain group of folks. So you don't need to pray for the people that God has already determined are going to hell. Why would you waste time praying for those folks? The problem with the pastor's response is there's no way to know who those people are. You don't know who are going and you don't know who are not going, according to the Calvinist idea. So you'd have to kind of treat everybody kind of the same. Now, it's a little bit deceptive because as a Calvinist, when you're talking to somebody and says Jesus, loves you and wants you to go to heaven, in the back of your head, you might be lying to that person. Because if God has already picked them to go to hell, then you're really not really telling them the truth. But what else could you do? So the idea that Calvinists don't preach only to the elect is a bad idea because you don't know who they are. And the idea that you don't pray for the salvation of the elect makes some sense because, again, if they're going to heaven from the beginning, what do you need to pray for them for? I mean, there's nothing that you could do or not do that's going to stop them from going to heaven. So what are you praying for? That's one conclusion you can come to. Now, both of those, while possible implications of Calvinism, it's the wrong response. Calvinism is, it's like any idea, there are different permutations of it. Let's say that the interim pastor perfectly explained all of the ideas of Calvinism, referenced Augustine and Trent and the Oranges and the Confessions and all. He just does a perfect example of what Calvinism is. The 9 Marks guy, Tibbian, he can still go, well, that's not what I believe. Because in any idea, there's different versions of it. And Tibbian could literally say, well, yeah, but I don't believe it. I got 2 more points, and you only listed 5. So I don't believe that. And then move on. It's a beautiful trick. It's a beautiful piece of deception to get out of being honest. Because again, when he says in the article, how do you answer that question? I would say, honestly. Yes, I'm a Calvinist. Not only am I Calvinist, but I'm a 7-point Calvinist. That's an honest answer. What he gave was deception, this Tibbian guy. Total deception. What the pastor's response should have been when Tibbian asks him, what do you think a Calvinist is? The interim pastor's response should have been, I'm the interviewer. I'm not up for the job. So it doesn't matter what I think Calvinism is. I need to know what you think it is. I need you to understand, tell me that you understand it. And if you agree with it, I want to know why. And if you don't agree with it, I want to know why. You don't allow the person you're interviewing to take over the interview. It's not a discussion between you. You have a very important job as interim pastor. The interim pastor has a responsibility to know what a wolf looks like. Because his church apparently has said, we don't want no wolves in our church. And this interim pastor is staring at one, and Tibbian doesn't even know it. So that's his responsibility. Which brings up a larger point. In the world, there are all kinds of really, really horrific ideas. Here in California, they want to teach your kids. They've got the public school system. It seems like its goal is to fill your kids with horrible ideas. And as parents, it's your responsibility to know what they are. So when your kid comes home talking some weird stuff, you need to be able to talk with them about those things. And you need to be able to talk with them intelligently, which means you have work to do. It's just like this interim pastor, he has a huge responsibility, and he failed his church. He should know. You could understand Calvinism in a weekend. It's not that complicated. There's so much information on it. This interim pastor who was leading the committee didn't do his work. And so he got suckered in by a wolf. So while the wolf is bad, they're always going to be out there. There's always going to be people like Tibbian out there. You as a sheep, I guess, if you want to make that comparison, you have a responsibility to not be a sheep. You've got to be as smart as the wolf. And this guy, this interim pastor, clearly did not hold up his responsibility. That's why he got suckered. But again, back to the slides. So while you have Tibbian now talking about the pastor's flawed ideas about Calvinism, guess what's not happening? There's no discussion about Calvinism qua Calvin. None at all. And he simply bypassed the whole idea, and apparently they moved on. Again, I'm only going from this article. I don't know what actually happened. Maybe if you talk to the interim pastor, he'd say, no, there was a whole different thing that went on. I don't know. Because again, this is Tibbian, in my estimation, not somebody you can trust. But the problem is this. When you're trying to discuss a particular reality, there are all kinds of things that people will try and do to keep you not talking about the reality, but their picture of reality. They'll do anything they can to keep you from trying to draw objective data from the reality that you're trying to model. And this bait and switch is just one of the ways that people will do it. And you have to be aware of that. When you're talking to somebody and you're asking about a particular thing and they want to move on to something else, know you're being suckered, or at least the attempt is being made to turn you into a sucker. And that's kind of what happened here. There's another problem that goes on with this article. Here you have what seems to be, let me see if I can get back to the original article. Here you have what seems to be a guy in Tibbian who is okay with deception. Not only is he okay with it, He seems to be rather proud of it, so much so that he's written an article saying, look how I tricked this guy who didn't want me as a pastor, but I tricked him anyway, and now I'm a pastor. He's almost gloating about it, which I find reprehensible. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm making too much of this. But again, I think if you're talking about a pastor, at the very least, you should be able to say about the guy, he deals honestly with people. He's going to give you an honest answer. He's not going to try and deceive you. But apparently here at 9marks.org, that's a cool thing. And the reason why I think it goes beyond Tibian is that this article is actually on their website. I mean, could you imagine working for a company where, I don't know, if you're in sales or something like that, and you write an article where you sold a bunch of product to somebody who told you, we don't want it, we don't need it, and want nothing to do with it, but your article says, well, I lied and I tricked him and I was able to sell him a whole bunch of our stuff even though he didn't want it. Is that an article you're going to print? If I was an editor, I'd go, no. As a matter of fact, I'd go, you should stop doing this kind of business practice. But by writing that article, or by putting this article and printing it, what 9marks is telling you, it seems to me, we're totally okay with this. We have no problem with our people going out and deceiving folks to become their pastors. And there just seems like something fundamentally wrong with that. Especially if you're going to be somebody who's supposedly modeling how God wants you to behave with other people. I just don't think deception is one of those things. And this Tibian guy, he's really, really good at it and proud of it. There seems something fundamentally wrong with that. And I just wonder how many other churches have gotten suckered like that because A, they didn't hold up their responsibility of understanding what Calvinism is or any other bad doctrine that they don't want to be a part of. And two, these guys over here being very, very comfortable at 9marks with lying and deceiving people so that they can insert themselves in to places where they are not wanted. It models this behavior that I think in some ways is borderline sociopathic. This idea that my goal is so good that I'm going to do it by any means necessary. That was a very common idea back in the 60s, and it's still a common idea now with very, very radical organizations. They feel like whatever we're doing is so good, whether the people we're going to put it on want it or not, whether they agree with it or not, we don't care. We're going to have it done by hook, by crook, by lying, stealing, and killing. And I'm not saying that's happening here. I'm simply saying there's no means by which they'll go, that's too far. And I think that's a little bit sociopathic. Matter of fact, before you think that I'm being hyperbolic about this, hold on just 1 second. Let me show you what I'm looking at here. It says here, sociopath, a mental health condition. And again, I'm not saying the guy's got a mental health condition. I'm simply talking about the behavior that seems to mirror this, in which a person consistently shows no regard for right and wrong and ignores the rights and feelings of others. Okay. Now, I think that in at least some way, that's what's going on here. This guy, Tibian, seems to have no regard for the desires of this church. He's like, I'm a Calvinist, I'm going to be your pastor, and I really don't care what kind of a pastor you want. That's bad behavior, in my opinion. That's not something that any pastor should emulate. But again, apparently at 9marks, it's laudable to deceive people. Doesn't make sense. All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for tuning in and Colored again. I just want to show you again different ways of modeling behavior, but you're going to run into a lot of people who do not want you to understand what the world is really like, what they're about, and they're going to hide it from you using different means. Deception is one of the main ways you do it, and this was a clear example, at least for me, a perfect example of the old bait and switch. You want to talk about this? I'm going to move the subject over here so we never talk about that thing. Because Tibian, and like a lot of people, don't want you to really know who they are. They're not going to be honest with you. But the other part of it is your responsibility. You can't expect people to be honest with you. It's your responsibility when you're watching the news to not believe what you're being told unless you have independently looked into it. It's your responsibility when you're listening to your professor to not just believe what he's saying unless you've independently investigated it for yourself. That's your responsibility. And if you don't do that, you're going to be taken by a whole bunch of people who just don't want you to know the truth, because what it gives them is now and this is the key, you no longer know what the truth is. You've taken their picture of the truth. And for you, that's what's going on. And when somebody goes, well, if you look at the truth, the reality, there's a lot of information there that is not in your picture. And there are some things that are in your picture that you can't find if you look at the reality. But you can only get that if you know that there's a reality different from the picture that you're being given from the news, from academia, from your friends, from social media. If you can't understand that there's something else going on that I need to look at, that they're getting this picture from, and I need to look at it myself, you're going to get suckered all the time. Happens all the time. All right, I'm just rambling on now. Thanks for tuning in to Uncolored, and please continue to like and subscribe. I appreciate all the support you've been giving me. And next time we'll do something a little bit different, but we'll continue on in this vein for just at least one more episode before we start moving into some other stuff. All right, that's enough out of me. Get out of here.